Those of us fortunate enough to call Central Oregon home know there's something special about this place, something beyond its scenic splendor and abundant recreational opportunities. It's a feeling of belonging, a sense of community and connection that's rare and precious. What's remarkable is the vital role one real estate developer has played in shaping the region that we love.
They've literally transformed this place. What we're doing, conserving wildlife habitat, protecting it for future generations, fits perfectly with the vision that Brooks has tried to build. They've looked long and hard at how they can build community, not just homes and subdivisions.
Brooks Resources has been a steady, guiding force in Central Oregon for 5 decades, a small company with a huge heart.
Bend as we know it wouldn't be Bend without Mike Holleran and Brooks Resources. They have that long-term, conscientious approach of how can I make Bend better.
To fully grasp the impact Brooks Resources has had on the region, you have to go back to the mid-60s, when much of Central Oregon was a blank canvas. Brooks Scanlon was one of the 2 mills operating in Bend.
Well, Bend in the 60s was a very different place. It was largely dependent on the sawmill industry, on the timber economy.
Brooks Scanlon had been here for half a century by then and was one of the largest employers in the region. The Minneapolis-based company had been buying timberland in Central Oregon since 1909 and was instrumental in bringing the railroad to Bend in 1911. The sawmill was built in 1915. It was one of the largest pine mills in the world. Mike Holleran's mother, Polly, was a member of the Brooks family. His father, John Holleran, was named president of Brooks Scanlon in 1954. Smart man that he was, John asked Mike to consider moving to Bend in 1965 to run the Western Timber operation. Mike was married to Sue and raising their young family in Northern California, where Mike worked for Stanford University. Mike, also a smart man, talked to his wife before making the decision.
I went home and talked to Sue, and we said, you know, what would you think of moving to Bend, Oregon? And she said, where?
I just thought if he thought this was a good idea, we'd give it a go. I knew him well enough to know he wouldn't put me in a situation that I wouldn't want to be in.
So we reached an agreement that we'd give it a try for 2 years. Either one of us wanted to leave at the end of 2 years, fine, we'd go.
Oh, I don't think it ever even came up again. We just knew we were here to stay.
Bend was a small town back then. Population about 11,000.
There wasn't very much downtown. There's no shopping really to speak of. Weddell's, because it had an elevator, which was very exciting. That was the only elevator in town.
Mike quickly learned the ins and outs of the timber industry, and then he discovered an opportunity for a new type of growth.
We own more than 200,000 acres of timberland and other land in Central Oregon as a timber company. And we knew that some of that land had a higher and better use in economic terms than growing trees in a 200-year cycle.
They decided what they were really in was the real estate business, so they formed a subsidiary, Brooks Resources. Of course, to enter the complicated, volatile real estate development business, someone on staff must have had vast experience in the field.
None whatsoever. We knew nothing about real estate.
So Mike looked for someone who did.
And I spent probably 6 months interviewing people, and we even had a headhunter trying to find someone to run a real estate company, and was really kind of disappointed in the kind of people that we ended up with. I finally, and it was a bit of exasperation, I said, okay, well, I want to hire one of the smartest guys I know. He happens to be an electrical engineer.
Bob Harrison was one of Mike's classmates at Stanford Business School. They decided to hire a couple of summer interns from Stanford to explore another potential side of the business, manufactured log homes. Bill Smith was one of those new interns.
3 or 4 weeks into that program, it was clear they shouldn't do that. And I had another summer student with me, and we debated for 5 minutes about whether we should make this job last all summer, because we could pretty easily. And I was being paid $900 a month, and I needed that $900. And so I went to Mike and said, there's no reason for you to work anymore on this. He said, fine, go to work for Bob. And that just...
Their ages at the time?
I was the old man. I was 31.
I was 29, I believe.
28.
You'd expect these sharp but inexperienced young developers to start small. Maybe build a few houses or a little subdivision on the edge of town. Fearless as they were, they started with a 2,000-acre project outside Sisters called Black Butte Ranch.
When I think back about it, our board of directors sat in Minneapolis. They looked very old, and how in the world they blessed us to be able to start Brooks Resources and start a very significant capital venture with one guy who knew nothing about real estate, one guy who'd been running a timber company, and Bill, who was just coming out of business school. The opportunity they gave us, unbelievably unique, without ties, was just a great opportunity.
This is the first time the three of them, the first three presidents of Brooks Resources, have been at Black Butte together in about 40 years. They showed up dressed in what they call the uniform.
Khakis, blue blazer, striped tie. I think we were trying to look older too, because our market was a little older.
Maybe the uniform was an attempt to sort of raise the bar in terms of credibility.
The year was 1969. Sun River was being developed as a resort community with its own commercial district. The team wanted Black Butte to be different, wanted Sisters to serve as the commercial center, rather than building one into Black Butte Ranch.
Sisters was a very small town. It had a sawmill, and the sawmill had closed, and the town was going through a period of real economic decline. It was a tough time for Sisters in the Sisters area.
They called it Dogtown. They would have these people that come to town with these big groups of dogs that they'd use for hunting, and it was a pretty rough and ready place.
We could have bought Sisters for well under $500,000, all of them, all of Sisters.
Rather than compete with the struggling town, they wanted to support it, give it an identity all its own. So they encouraged downtown business owners to create Western-themed facades, even provided architectural design services and interest-free loans to help with the cost.
It's been what's really saved Sisters and made it a unique place. Because every place else you go, it all looks like the outskirts of Tempe, Arizona.
With Black Butte Ranch moving along nicely, they decided to start developing another piece of land, Mount Bachelor Village, as vacation homes for skiers. Most of the units were pre-sold. Then the oil embargo hit.
We went back to those people and said, that's something new, and we'll let you out of your agreement to buy them. And every single one of them said, okay, thank you very much, and we won't buy those units, even though we were building them, with the exception of Bill Healy, who was the head of Mount Bachelor and who had committed to buy one and still did.
Potential buyers from the valley worried they'd get to Central Oregon and not be able to get gas to get back home. So Mike and his team came up with a creative solution. They brought gas tankers to make sure buyers could refill their tanks. The company came through the crisis and projects were back on track. Brooks Resources was spun off from Brooks Scanlon as a separate company in 1979. Its leaders decided to try their hand in Washington State. It was a humbling experience.
We expanded very rapidly into a number of areas, including particularly the Tri-Cities of Washington, where the Washington Public Power Supply System was building nuclear plants. And we took on a lot of debt, which we'd never done before as a company, but we thought, okay, the real estate companies should borrow money. And that turned out for us to be a very, very difficult experience, and we had a hard time swallowing that and taking care of the bank debt.
They shifted their focus back to Bend and developed Shevlin Center, Aubrey Butte, Century Washington Center. Then came an idea for something different, a master plan that seemed more like a step back in time than a step forward.
Northwest Crossing was all about how do we create a quality environment that looks just like town? Because we knew that some of the favorite real estate in towns is usually the old parts of towns with great homes and walkable communities and parks.
Bucking the trend at the time, they placed alleys behind homes, built wide front porches. This return to Mayberry feel resonated with people, especially young families. Mike Tennant partnered with Brooks Resources to create Northwest Crossing.
I used to be a developer where I'd come in and say, hey, how many lots can I do? How quick? And it was all about price point. And I always watched Brooks, Mike Holleran and their team, how they developed Aubrey Butte, Mount Bachelor Village, Aubrey Glen, Shevlin Industrial Park. And it's different. Doing something different, but adding value for the long term, creating something where people were pleased to be a part of, to call home. And so Northwest Crossing, we did that.
With one company owning so much property, the region could have looked much different today.
Bend has been blessed by having large pieces of land, which allowed us to master plan them as opposed to the more typical development in cities where you do 5, 10, 20 lots at a time and it ends up being kind of a mishmash.
Their mode of operation is really, how do we do the right thing, but not necessarily how do I impose my will upon you, but how do we find a solution together that works the best, I think, for the long run. And I think that's a great example that Brooks Resources sets, is really not looking out for this year's profits, next year's profits, but what does the community look like when their work is done at the end of the day or the decade or the century.
Absent Brooks Resources, Central Oregon would not have grown and improved on every step of the way. The thing I'm most proud of about Brooks Resources is they were given a beautiful area to work in and they didn't screw it up.
In fact, they've worked to solve problems, like bringing roundabouts to Bend to improve traffic flow as Bend has grown. Evidence of how the company has built community can be seen all around Bend through its support of education, healthcare, social services, and the arts. Giving back to the community is deeply embedded in the company's culture.
We had a very clear set of values. We give away a minimum of 3% of our pre-tax profits to charities of one sort or another. We encourage our employees to participate in the community in a very broad way.
One day in the 70s, a young man named Don Kerr came to Mike with what Mike refers to as a crazy idea to build a natural history museum. Don needed connections and funding to realize his dream.
He had to beat the streets to find backup and support and talk to everybody about his idea. And everybody except Brooks Resources told him to pack up and go home and get a real job.
Mike listened, then posed some tough questions to Don, who returned with solid answers. Besides support to build the museum, Don also needed land. Brooks Resources donated 135 acres.
To have a piece of property on the highway donated, it was unthinkable. It was a huge deal.
Bend wouldn't be Bend. We wouldn't have High Desert Museum. We wouldn't have the Athletic Club of Bend. We wouldn't have roundabouts. We wouldn't have arts and public spaces. We wouldn't have the trails like down on Deschutes River. That's valuable land, valuable real estate. But Mike sees it comes back in other ways.
The Bend Foundation, established by Brooks Scanlon and now funded in part by Brooks Resources, has been sending quiet but strong ripples of support throughout Bend since 1947.
It makes me proud and warms my heart to see the impacts that the Bend Foundation has. It's not just the amazing art that they've supported in our roundabouts and other locations through art in public places, but it's supporting capital campaigns and it's supporting the growth of some of our social services and really making a difference in how Bend has been able to support its residents.
That supportive spirit emanates from deep within Brooks Resources.
The culture at Brooks has always felt like a family. We're a very tight-knit group that works very closely together, and it's really wonderful.
My greatest achievement in putting any of this together is really hiring really truly smart people who work well together.
Brooks Resources gave us an opportunity to work as a team with a group of people, very, very special people, over an extended period of time to success. And all of those relationships ended up to be an extremely positive fabric that I can look back on. And I was blessed to be able to be a part of establishing those. And a lot of those have lasted. We're talking about 50 years later. We're sitting here relishing what opportunity that was given to us.
Remarkable people transforming opportunity into community, creating a lasting legacy and a vibrant future for this place we're all proud to call home.